Hi everyone, and welcome to our talk on Contemporary Digital Linguistics and the Archive, an urgent review. I'm here with Sarah Babinski to talk about some recent work we've been doing on evaluating archives for potential issues in using them in the future for linguistic projects. So let's start by thinking about the problem that we're aimed at looking at. Digital language corpora are very heterogeneous, and of course they should be heterogeneous. They're recorded under many different circumstances with many different types of material. But for digital work, most of our standards were formalized 15 years or more ago, before much recent digital work was possible. So for instance, we can look at the Burden-Simons 2003 or Linda Barwick's 2006 paper to see about the types of standards that digital collections are being created with standards for. But in the last 15 years, many new types of digital materials can be created. We can manipulate digital files in many different ways. And it's possible that our archival standards haven't really caught up with that. So for instance, we can do things with our corpora that were just either totally impossible 15 years ago or required huge amounts of additional equipment, like for instance, doing phonetic analyses on laptops or running text-to-speech and speech-to-text programs. So that's part of our problem. The other part of this problem is that much of our linguistic training focuses on producing materials for archives, not working on materials from archives. And this is a bit of a generalization, but on the whole, our training looks something like this, where we have a gigantic amount of workflow and discussion around preparing materials, preparing elicitation sessions and field sessions, post-processing that data and so on. And then the end point is to send to archive, which I've circled here in purple. So we think about the language documentation process as where the archives are the end point of this process, not as the beginning point. So what does this look like when take from archive or use with archive is the starting point for a set of materials? And so that's the question that Sarah and I are asking. Are our collections as useful as they could be when they become the primary mode of linguistic research? So should we do things better than we're currently doing them? Are we making more work for ourselves with our current practices? And are we causing problems for our future selves? So future linguists who are going to be primarily relying on archival materials for endangered languages, for instance, are they going to be able to do the things they want to do because of the decisions we've made? So today we're going to talk about those sorts of questions. So what types of variation are there in digital corpora? How does this variation affect what's possible in terms of analyses? And how does the structure of the corpus facilitate or impede work with the collection by people who didn't collect those materials in the first place? To address these questions, we're currently looking at a sample of 23 different collections from Paradisec, ELA, and IATSIS, so 3 prominent digital archives. All of these collections were collected using the best practices of the time. There's a combination of digitized corpora and natively digital corpora, so corpora that were recorded digitally from the start. Our materials date from the 1970s to about 2010. And all of these deposits have audio files, and almost all of them have ELAN transcription files as well. And we're combining this with the collected experience working with text files and corpus materials from the Turella Documentation Project for Australian languages. And just before we go on, I just want to make it clear that this is not some sort of gotcha type audit where we are trying to name and shame corpora for being hard to use or anything like that. While our examples are real, our illustrations for this talk were created for the purpose. And so we're not going to name any particular collections. Rather, what we want to do is focus on collective standards and better practices, not on criticizing individuals, because as field workers ourselves, we realize that materials are collected under many different circumstances, and as part of making archives and so on, huge numbers of choices need to be made. I should also stress that we're not working by the numbers, as it were. So this is not a review of corpora and collections based on the size of the corpora or the amount of materials. Rather, it's based on the function to which the materials in the corpus can be put. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to hand over to Sarah, who's going to talk about the types of issues that we've found in the collections that we've looked at.
Great, thanks. So when we were looking at these corpora, we came across a handful of sort of categories of issues, which I'll sort of summarize here and then go into more detail with some examples after that. So first we have missing information, things that should be there but aren't. And these can be either recoverable or non-recoverable. So if missing information is recoverable, you can sort of reconstruct the thought process of the archiver or manually fix something to make things work the way that you need them to and have the information that you need. But sort of the more crucial and serious issue is when information is not recoverable in its archived state. So if there are completely missing files, missing transcriptions or translations, things that the person using your collection can't actually figure out by looking at it themselves. And then we also have information that's not missing, but that causes other sorts of issues. So we have information that just shouldn't be there. It's just kind of a mistake and it needs to be deleted. And this is usually just annoying and doesn't necessarily cause huge issues in our the processing on the part of the person using your materials. And then there are also errors. Of course, we all try to avoid having errors in our content or in where things are placed. For example, if you had a translation on a tier where a transcription was meant to be. But of course, that's also something that we should be thinking about. And content errors in particular, again, can't be recovered by the person who's using your materials. So that could sort of end up compounding in certain situations when someone else is using your data. And then there's also information that is fine, it should be there, but for formatting reasons or other sorts of issues, it causes a lot of just time-consuming inconvenience on the part of the person who's using your materials. Okay, so let's start with some things that shouldn't be there. So these are things that are not missing. They are should be fixed and should be deleted in some cases. So for example, we have a situation where there are multiple copies of the same file, different versions of the same file. So for an example here, we have an original file from 2005, it seems, based on the dates we have, that has a particular name. And then the archiver has revised this and created a revised version. These are the top files with rev at the end. And these are obviously much more recent passes through the data. They had been modified actually the day of the screenshot. So of course, that's the transcription and the translation that we'll want to use. But the issue is that the file name is now different than the name of the audio WAV file. So when you open your ELAM file, it won't be able to find this WAV file, and you may actually think when you're first looking at this that the files that have the same name are the ones that go together, when in fact it would be better to use the revised versions. And then we have errors. So some of these include font and encoding issues, such as stray non-printing characters, non-breaking spaces, single Chinese characters that usually show up because of some kind of font problem or a conversion issue. And then there are also encoding conversion errors. So for example, legacy Mac files may be incorrectly saved as Unicode. So if we have a nice, perfectly good looking word like Nachi, it could end up being converted into something completely unreadable and not recoverable by the person looking at your data. And we also have an issue with delimiters being in the wrong places. So for example, tabs within your records could cause problems in terms of reading in files by any sort of automatic computational type program, which can cause a lot of havoc on the part of people using your collection. And there are also errors of different types. So file name mismatches, we sort of covered that already. Different types of line breaks. So Mac and Windows have different ways of printing line breaks to begin with. So that's not a huge issue and is something that anyone using your information should be aware of, but it becomes an issue when the types of line breaks are inconsistent. So inconsistency is really a big problem, especially when you're using automatic methods. They can be really hard and really annoying to fix. And there are also underlines that you create in a Word document, for example, that then gets lost when imported into other programs. So sort of formatting issues that don't translate across different file formats, and that is then information lost. And now I will give it back to Claire to talk about some more of the issues that we've come across.
Right, so Sarah talked about the types of material that is there and either raises errors or causes more work for processing. Another large collection of issues for working with corpora are the things that should be there but aren't. That is the missing material that wasn't archived along with the collection, but is nonetheless important for being able to work with the collection materials. And I'll start by just giving one example of things like this. So take a file like this. This is an ELAN transcript file where we have the file, the speech segmented into utterances, but the transcripts are empty here. So we have nothing in the transcript file, nothing in the translation file. And so presented with a file like this, it's not clear to someone who's using the collection for the first time whether this is an import error, whether it was something where the files were created, but the researcher didn't have time to transcribe them, which is, of course, a very common problem. But faced with this sort of thing, we don't know if this is an import error and the material is available elsewhere, or whether it's genuinely missing data that was not collected. We have quite a few different types of crucially missing files in archives. So we have things like ELAN preference files, where for the most part, the preferences contain information that is recoverable, but they also contain information where there are multiple audio files, what the offset should be. And so if those files are not recorded, then the transcripts, the alignments on the tiers do not align properly with the files that should be, that are connected to it through the audio. The empty annotations I talked about. We have things, again, with, say, toolbox settings files or material that is partially recoverable, given that toolbox often uses a set of standard format markers. But we also have cases where the researchers make up their own backslash codes, and then if those are not recorded, then we don't know, or we have to guess about what sort of information is there. Or if there are multiple versions of files, we need to guess which crucial versions of the texts or the lexicon link to each other for the parser. We also have the converse problem, where if the toolbox settings files were not archived as part of the archive, sometimes we only have the toolbox settings file. So we have the project file or we have the font files, but the data files were stored in a separate location on the computer and were not included in the archive. And of course, that's absolutely crucially missing for working with the language. More generally, we find examples of missing metadata or metadata that's partially complete or insufficiently linkable to the collection. So we know that there are several speakers, maybe speaking several different languages, but we don't know which files go with which speaker, for example. There are also things that are maybe not quite missing information, but cause issues for mapping between the information, the types of information that are there, because we have things like tier names and speakers, but we're not quite sure which goes with which. And there are many different ways to do this with ELAN. So, okay, so that's a brief summary of the most common types of issues we found in looking at the corpora that we've examined. Now I'd like to go on to talking about some of the recommendations. And these are very much work in progress and things that we would like to discuss as a field and as a set of documenters in collaboration with all the people we work with and archives and so on as well. So first of all, for recommendations, while working on the collection itself and while working on the materials for archiving, consistency is really important. So be as consistent as possible and document the decisions that you make about the choices for how you set up files, okay? And that will be useful both for your future self, but also for future archive users as well, who won't have access to the decisions that you made and why you made them. While archiving, while preparing the collection for archiving, you should ask, does this file need to be there? So that will both cut down on material that is archived that probably shouldn't have been archived, like the multiple version control issues, but also on missing data or missing settings files and things like that. So you might want to do some tests on your archived materials and imagine that you're working with that collection rather than your day-to-day collection materials. Can you find everything you need? Is everything linked in the way that you expect it to be linked? And you might want to think about what other users of the collection might need in the future. So say, for example, you are not doing speech to text work, but you could imagine your corpus being used for speech to text work in the future. Are the relevant files there, for example? And for the future, we'd like to see some improved infrastructure for corpus processing and things like validation checks, which field workers could do before uploading their collections. And I know some archives have things along these lines for, say, validating directory structure and file format and things like that. But we feel that these could be built into the kind of pre-archiving process and could be, at least to some extent, archive neutral as well. I think so. In this slide, which you're welcome to pause the video and look at, we have some more information about types of solutions, types of things that we talked about earlier about while working with the collection. So thinking about standardizing sampling rates and file types, noting which types of information are missing for yourself and adding that sort of material. Being consistent with file formats where possible, and also keeping an eye on things which are less consistent and may not make much of a difference for humans interacting with the collection, like notes in tiers and things like that, but being aware that they make a big difference for computational processing, and they can make the difference between a corpus that's very easy to use and easy to, say, turn into a talking dictionary or something like that, and a corpus that's quite difficult to use for that sort of computational processing. Okay. I want to say something very brief about validation checks as well. So there are, of course, a number of validation checks that could be done, but we were thinking things along the lines of work that could be done for field workers while they are still processing their collection. So thinking about, for instance, what is in transcripts? What is the most common character in a transcript? If there are large numbers of single words that have X or XXX or something like that, then that would be an indication that that file hasn't been properly transcribed or that file needs more information. We could imagine a validation check where we have a list of files, and if the collection identifies toolbox settings files or toolbox data files, are there also settings files? So are there text files with / codes? And if so, are there also .pij files and things like that? if there are .eaf files, are there also .pfs files, things like that. And if those files are missing, the collector could be asked if they need to be included. And that would raise consciousness around what's missing, while not forcing the collector to use a particular set of formats. And now I'm going to hand back to Sarah for conclusions.
Right, so really the main takeaways here are, these archives and archival materials are extremely important, both for communities and for linguists going into the future. And we want to continue to be able to use them. But as we've sort of talked about here, they aren't necessarily as useful as they could be. There are things that we can do better, but a lot of these things are fixable. So going back to our original questions, what types of variation are there in digital corpora? A lot. So some of this is inevitable, but some of it could really be streamlined and made more consistent. How does this variation affect what's possible? So this can increase manual processing time if things are inconsistent or if there are a lot of errors. And it can even make some types of work impossible. So we, of course, want to try to avoid that as much as we can. And how does the structure of the corpus facilitate or impede work with the collection? So with missing information and data, we really come across a lot of issues. It can really impede the work that people want to do with archival materials, especially as we are now in this more digital age. Okay, thank you again for coming to this talk, and we look forward to hearing your questions and comments.